revitalized and all churches engaged and the pastors of the association encouraged. And this lunch kind of sits at the nexus of several of those things, as we hope to be an encouragement and also encourage in the process of revitalization, or the renewal of churches that may be growing and doing well, but man, we're all in need of constant renewal. So I hope that it is an encouragement to you on that end. We do have a number of options as an association for churches that are considering revitalization or wondering what the next phase for them may be. We are starting a network of coaches to help pastors who are in that space and intentionally moving forward toward revitalization. So we have some pastors in the association who are experienced in that and ready to help coach any brothers who want that. We also have a series of surveys, both spiritual, financial analysis, building and operational or facilities templates that can help a church assess where they're at, and then we can help them process that, even using some AI tools that we've developed to give some feedback on both where they are and some suggestions on how to move forward. So if your church is in that space, or you know a church that you've been having conversations with that would love some help, we would be happy to have just an initial discovery conversation with them, and feel free to make the connection as necessary. I'm going to hand it off to Bob, who's going to introduce our speaker for the day. Yep.
I'm so glad you guys are here. My name is Bob Bickford. If I haven't met with you, I'm the executive director here. And I'd like to introduce my team to you. You've met Nick, who is our renewal strategist. Over here is Randy Howell. He is our operations and lead of all things strategic. And Randy works with numbers and processes and systems. And he also assists churches as they're thinking about those things too. One of the things I told Randy a while back was find places to save us money. And he has gone through all of our spending and all of our budgets and our contracts, and he is able to do that. He's able to tell us when our softwares are out of sync and where they need to sync and which ones we need to ditch and all those kinds of things. If you don't have somebody that can do that for you, he's available to you to use in that way. As well, he can advise you on social media strategies and a bunch of different things. So we're glad to serve churches who may not have someone who could do that. Gary Morgan is our church planting strategist, and Gary is a longtime Nashvilleian, and he excels at people and environments and golf and culture. And here's what I love about Gary, is wherever you are, he probably has a story about your demographic. He knows all about your area, and he can walk you through. One of the things that he does along with Brett is they do missional mapping to help you understand how do we maximize the gospel impact right around our church. As our people disperse, how do we help them think about sharing their Jesus story in their workplaces, their neighborhoods, where they live and play and recreate and all those things. Brett Bosch, right over here. Brett, you might have met Brett. Brett is our community engagement and connections strategist. He works with our ethnic churches. He's been a missionary in Turkey. He is considering and praying through church planting. He does a lot of different things. And so if you're interested in demographics or ethnic partnerships, he is a wonderful resource for you. So we're grateful for the opportunity to serve you. Matt Gray is our board chairman, and Matt is also a pastor of a renewal work, First Baptist Antioch. And so Matt was one of the first people that I met when I got elected to this role. And so Matt's been a dear friend for a while. We love churches. If you watch our social media, here's one thing you'll realize. We are in churches of all sizes. I'll attend a church of 6, of 2,000, of 200, and 100. It doesn't matter. So we serve all of our 150 plus churches. So I just want you to know we're here for you. We're here to walk with you. I have the privilege of introducing a dear friend of mine that I've known for about 10 years plus now, Brian Croft. He and I met when I was working as a replant strategist with the North American Mission Board, and as I was pastoring a church in the St. Louis area. And so Brian and I talked renewal, but what I found is Brian was a pastor to pastors, and he pastored me. He loved me as a brother, And I couldn't think of anybody better to come and speak about not losing heart in the work of renewal. So would you welcome Brian Croft, please?
Thank you, Bob. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you. Thank you for coming. I knew you could be a lot of places in this moment, so I want to take seriously that you've chosen to be here and want to use the time well and hopefully steward it in a way that's going to be a benefit and encouragement to each of you. I just personally want to commend Bob Bickford and his team here. Bob is my longtime good friend, and I was just so excited when I heard he was coming here to serve. Knowing Bob a long time and knowing the experiences and the wisdom he brings in this particular area of ministry, I was excited about him coming here and seeing what God might do. And it's pretty amazing what's happened, the team that's formed these last couple of years. And so just so you know, I travel all over the world. I work with all kinds of associations and state conventions and things. And this is what's happening here in Nashville is one of the most excited I am about and what's happening here. So you should be encouraged by what's happening. I want to encourage you to get involved with the association and the value that this association is bringing to the churches. So thank you for being here. Here's kind of the format. I want to open the Word together and share a little bit. I'll share a little bit about my story with you, just so you can kind of know the context, where I'm coming from. And then I want to allow some time for Q&A. I find that's a helpful way to just think about the things we're talking about. When we're talking about church renewal, church revitalization, those kinds of things, I think it's helpful to just hear from each other. And so when the time comes, the question you have, I want to encourage you to ask it. Probably somebody else in the room is feeling that question, and will be helped just to hear, oh, I'm not the only one that, I thought I was crazy. I'm the only one that thinks this. So the Q&A time is a helpful time for you all to hopefully learn from each other. So that's the plan, and then we will wrap as scheduled. All right. So how about I pray and ask God to just bless our time together, and then we will dive right in. Let's pray together. Oh Lord, your steadfast love reaches to the heavens, and your faithfulness to the skies. And Lord, we praise you that your justice flows as like a mighty mountain, and your justice flows like the evening tide. And we give you praise and thanks that you are the creator and the sustainer of the universe, and in your kind and mysterious providence have brought every man and woman here in this moment to look at your word, to consider what you have for us today. So Lord, would you give us grace and faith that you will speak to each one of us to help us, to encourage us, and to help us to press on and not lose heart in the important work you have called each one of us to. And we ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. A little background on me. First of all, my wife, Cara, of almost 30 years. God willing, into this year will be 30 years. Sends her greetings. My 4 children send their greetings. I officiated the wedding of my niece in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where I'm from, where we drove down from this morning. Officiated that wedding over the weekend, and all 4 of my children came into town for that, so we were all together, which was really nice. My son Samuel is 26 years old, lives in Mankato, Minnesota. 3 daughters. Abby's 24, Isabelle is 21, and Claire is 19. So it was a real blessing to have everybody together. Those who have grown kids know when everybody comes together at the same time, it's a rare moment, and it was really special to be together. I have been in ministry for over 30 years. I was a pastor for 25 years. I served in associate pastor roles, a variety of associate pastor roles for about my first 8 years of ministry. And then I went to be the senior pastor of Auburndale Baptist Church, which is in the south end of Louisville, Kentucky, this really dense, urban, poor area of Louisville, and went into a dying church to see if God might revive it. And I'm going to share a little bit about my story around that. But I ended up being the pastor there for 17 years. And the ministry Practical Shepherding that I lead was just early years was created. We didn't know we were starting a ministry, just a heart to want to train and care for pastors. And that started in the early years of the church and just grew slowly to where 5.5 years ago, I left pastoring for the first time in 25 years to lead this ministry full time. And that's what I've been doing. My right-hand man for almost 8-9 years of the ministry is Sean Corser. Sean's in the back here. He'll be at the table out here. If you got any questions on resources, find him. But Sean has been my right-hand man as this ministry has grown, and we've been able to really thrive in a lot of ways. So grateful to be able to lead this. And this gives me a freedom to be here, to be a part of this with you all. I want to ask you to take your Bible and turn, if you have a Bible. If not, I'll read it for us. 1 Corinthians chapter 16. As you're doing that, I want to, as we're talking about church revitalization, I just want to kind of state some obvious things for many of you who know these are obvious. So I just want to begin, lay the groundwork for what we're going to talk about by highlighting this. So ministry is just hard. It just is. There's unique joys that come with ministry. Unique joys that only pastors and ministry leaders and spouses and there's unique joys we get to experience. But there's also there's unique difficulties. There's unique challenges that only pastors and pastors' wives and families feel. And so I just want to highlight that. Ministries in general, it's hard. The reason I can just say that generally without even knowing all of you and knowing your ministry is that I think it's part of God's design that it's hard. Otherwise, everybody do it. Everybody's not supposed to do this. That's why calling is so important. And yet what I've found in 30 years of ministry, and my ministry takes me all over the world, and it doesn't matter the country, context, or culture of wherever I am, there are some places that ministry is uniquely hard. And I would say most of the time in the work of church renewal, church revitalization, going into an established church that's unhealthy, in decline, dysfunctional, whatever things you want, labels you want to give it, I have found that ministry is uniquely hard. And I think it's uniquely hard for a few reasons. So our ministry would define a hard place this way. If you're taking any notes, you can write these down. But there's 3 characteristics I think make something uniquely hard. So we've said ministry's hard in general. But then there's things that make ministry kind of really hard. Here's the first one we found. And that is economically impoverished. If you're trying to do ministry in a poorer environment, not a lot of resources, not a lot of, just funds and things to be able to do the work you need to do in the church, there's a lot of challenges with that. Your congregation they may be generous and kind and giving, but they don't have a lot to give, and you're trying to figure out how do you fund the ministry in this church. So economically impoverished areas create unique difficulties. Our ministry actually particularly is going to poor, forgotten places in the world to care for pastors, because we found they need us the most. So we're going to go to the places where they need us. And so we're trying to travel all over the world and do that work, because the economic impoverished nature of things creates unique difficulties. So that's number 1. Number 2, we would identify a hard place, geographically isolated. And so that can be, some of you may be coming from rural contexts. I actually went to Belmont University in Nashville here. So I love this city and got to know it some, being a student here for a few years. Long time ago, by the way. But obviously that's in the middle of the city. And so the geographic isolation certainly can happen in rural contexts. But I also want to highlight, it also can happen in very dense urban contexts. And so don't think rural urban and that determines whether it's isolated or not. I know tons of people in very isolated places in the middle of a city, and they just feel like they're alone. They're surrounded by lostness and wickedness and those who are trying to come against them. That creates its own isolation. So geographic isolation is one of the things that I think can make it a uniquely hard place. But here's a third one, and I think particularly important when we're talking about church renewal work: spiritual barrenness. Spiritual barrenness. One of the things that can make ministry particularly hard is depending on the kind of darkness you walked into. The darkness of the community, the darkness of your own church that you walked into is real. It's palpable. And a lot of times that spiritual darkness is what actually makes this work so uniquely hard. And I would assume, depending on where you're coming from, every one of you could probably identify how that shows up in your own ministry context. But I'll tell you one of the main ways spiritual darkness shows up in our ministry context, especially with church renewal, is through the opposition we face. So, economic impoverished, geographic isolated, but then spiritual barrenness that oftentimes leads to opposition against us, against our ministries, the spiritual attacks that come. And so the problem when pastors take their families into particularly hard places, especially in a church renewal setting, one of the problems is a lot of times we have one of two reactions when we go in there. And it's a lot harder than somebody said it was going to be. And we find ourselves there, and we moved our family into the parsonage or whatever. And what do? The problem of going into these places is a lot of times there's a panic that comes. What did I just do? What did I just walk into? What did I just drag my family into? So there's oftentimes a panic that something's wrong. And a lot of times this leads to then an impatience of, God better hurry up and work. And we all of a sudden put this timeline on the work of revitalization and renewal. But here's the problem. It's not fast work, is it? It's not fast work. I've rarely seen church renewal and revitalization happen of any kind of fast pace. It's usually really slow. And by the way, I think that's part of God's design as well. So what do we do with this typical tenure still of pastorates that last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? I mean, so to go into a church renewal situation and expect to see a bunch of change in 2 years, is that a realistic expectation? I don't think so. I don't think you can see much in a church ministry in 2 years. Here's what we can determine in about 2 years, though. 2 years is just enough time for the pastor to realize what a mess of a church he just took. And 2 years is just enough time for that church to realize what a mess of a pastor they just got. And I think the real ministry of renewal starts then, at the 2-year mark, where the pastor realizes what he's working with now and the church realizes what they got in a pastor. I think that's when the ministry begins. So isn't it an irony, brothers and sisters, that 2 years would be the time where many pastors evaluate, is this going to turn or not? When that's actually the starting place. And so then when we evaluate that at 2 years and we go, this is hopeless, I'm going to go to the next place. Oh, nothing changed in 2 or 3 years here, I'm going to go to the next place. And we create this thing in the SBC that we have a major problem with, is short-term pastorates. Because I think largely for two reasons. One, it's harder than they thought, so they panic. And two, they think the work's supposed to be done quicker than it's actually being done. I think those are two of the biggest obstacles to church renewal. And I think there's a different paradigm. And I actually think it's clearly in the Bible. And that's what I want us to look at here in 1 Corinthians in a moment. But here's what I want, the paradigm I want to paint for you. Here's the key, I believe, to not only doing church renewal, church revitalization, but also to do it in a way that you don't lose heart. Can we all agree the best way to lose heart is to think this is supposed to go faster than it's actually designed to go? That's one of the first problems. So here's a paradigm I want to give you that I think changes this. It's a paradigm that says 2 years is just enough time for you to realize what you have to work with, not the time to evaluate whether this is going to change or not. It's a paradigm that says if you're not willing to go to a church and stay a minimum of 5 years, that you won't even go, because you would recognize you'll leave the church worse off if you leave inside of that and keep them on that same cycle they've been on. Here's another part of this paradigm, though, that I think is essential. When the adversaries show up, and some of them were on the pastoral search team that hired you, what if that's a sign from God to stay, not leave? What if it's a sign from God that you're actually in the right place, you're not in the wrong place? And I think we see this actually in 1 Corinthians. So turn there with me. 1 Corinthians 16. I don't know about you, I always found a great deal of comfort and encouragement that the Corinthian church is highlighted in the New Testament. Because I remember reading the Corinthian letter and thinking, oh, they're a mess. And then I'd look at our church and go, oh, we're a mess. I think we're in good company somehow with this. And by the way, when we read 1 Corinthians, it's important to know that this letter we know famously as this giant rebuke, this correction letter, and it certainly is. But you know what we miss? We miss it opens by Paul telling the church, I see all these evidences of grace in you. Remember, it starts that way. What's he saying? He's telling the Corinthian church, of all churches, God's at work in you. God's working here. Which is why I've got to write this hard letter to address some of these issues you all need to address. And so we get into the middle of 1 Corinthians, and then we see this giant rebuke and correction and a strong, harsh letter even. And so I think when we come to the beginning of chapter 16, the very end here, can you imagine being a member of the Corinthian church, by the way, and like this letter shows up? Remember, they gather everybody together, hear it read aloud. Can you imagine? Paul's letter came. Grab the kids. Let's all come together and hear what he has to say to us. And then this is read aloud to everybody to be able to hear. I would imagine if I was a member of the Corinthian church, by the time I came to the end of chapter 15, the beginning of 16, other than being really excited that the resurrection's real, I would have this thought. I'm not sure Paul likes adversaries. The presence of adversaries is the sign from Paul he's supposed to stay. And how often is that the sign to us we're supposed to leave? But Paul actually flips that script, doesn't it? That paradigm on its head. So to not lose heart and to be able to press on and persevere in hard, uniquely hard, church renewal, church revitalization situations, I want to offer 3 things to you from this. So if you're taking notes, you can write these down. Feel free. 3 ways that I think come from these 2 reasons. First way, to not lose heart and to persevere in the work, number 1 is to stay. Stay. By the way, there are 3 S's, so you're welcome. I know I'm in a room full of Baptists. So, first is to stay. Look down at verse 9. For a wide door of effective work has opened to me. So I can't leave yet. It's this point. This wide door of effective work is open to me. This open door of ministry. I think we're asking the wrong question when we are trying to think about what is God's will for my life in the ministry call He has given me. So often when we're in a hard ministry context and then we get another offer from somewhere else that looks so much better and more money and we can live in a nicer place and whatever it might be. It just looks so much better. I mean, I know the saying is the grass is greener on the other side, but it's green over there. Like, usually that's how we try to determine what God's call and will is for our life. And I think we're asking the wrong question. I'm not God. God's going to move us and show us the next place in all kinds of different ways. I recognize that. But I just want to challenge this a little bit. The wrong question is, would I love to go there and serve? That's the wrong question. I think here's the more appropriate question based on verse 9. Have I completed what God sent me here to do first? I think that's the better question. Again, if we're asking, how do I discern God's call and will on my life? Have I finished what God sent me here to do first before I leave to go to the next place? See, ministry being hard is not the criteria that we're in the wrong place. It kind of means you're in ministry probably. And if you went into a dying church and you thought it was going to be easy, somebody sold you a lie. It's most all the time hard, uniquely hard. But that doesn't mean we don't go there. And I want to push back on this idea that, and I see it in America more than anywhere in the world. Somehow ministry being hard is a sign something's wrong. Adversaries coming against you, something's wrong. But what if it's showing you're in exactly where you're supposed to be? And we have to flip the way we view this. I think one of the ways to help us keep from jumping too quickly to the next place, because ministry is uniquely hard where we are, is to ask this question about complete. You went there and went all in and took your family and everything because you felt called to go there. Doesn't it make sense if we want to read God's will for our life, we would ask the question, well, God sent me here. I know that for certain. I don't know if I'm supposed to go there or go over here, but I know I'm supposed to be here. How do I know if I'm supposed to move? Well, I think that's the better question. God sent me here. Have I completed whatever it is he called me to do here? And by the way, that is not to make us stay 40 years in the same place. I don't think that's God's will for most people. I think that's an amazing thing if that happens, but that's just not the way it works. There's plenty of reasons to go to the next ministry place. But I think the bigger question we always have to wrestle with is why? Why am I supposed to go to the next place? And I think the better question, if we truly want to honestly evaluate what God's will is for our life, for our family, is have I completed what God sent us here to do before I can go to the next place? Can we all agree? If we really want to thrive somewhere, we really want to see the fruit of our ministry come about, can we all agree we probably have to stay long enough to see it? To see it. I don't know anybody who is described as persevering by leaping to a new ministry every 2 to 3 years throughout their whole ministry. That's not at all how we'd characterize them. If we want to persevere and be faithful and see the fruit of the ministry we do, I think we have to stay long enough at least to see that. So number one is stay. We have to resolve, we have to stay. And I think that's a key part in us not losing heart as we do this work. Number two is stand. We've got to stay, and then we've got to stand. And we see this reason, from the second reason in verse 9. Look down there again. A wide door of effective work has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. I get it when the adversaries show up, and especially when it's particularly jolting when they claim to be your closest friends when you went there. And then they show up as your adversaries. I get that as jolting to the system and to the heart. But why are we surprised? Well, I get it's painful, I get it's hard, but why are we surprised? Because see, if you went into a church renewal, revitalization situation, a church that's been dying for decades, a church that's had no or very little gospel presence and witness in the community, and you all of a sudden show up wanting to do faithful gospel ministry and care for these people and try to reach the community and all that, why are we surprised when we enter into that kind of darkness? That the enemy is then prowling like a lion looking for someone to devour, and he's probably coming after you, and he's coming after your family first. Why are we surprised? I know that's hard. It's really hard, actually. But why are we surprised when that happens? I think that's the better question to ask. What made us think that if we're going to enter into darkness to do kingdom-building work in the world, that somehow the enemy's not going to be okay with that? So we have to stand. That's one of the other ways we don't lose heart. Is not only we stand, God's sending us there to stand. He's calling us to do that. That's what you know, the number one question I get, Bob gets, others get around church revitalization conversations, like, man, where do I start? Like, this is a mess, and this is a mess over here, and I don't even know where to start. By the way, in the Q&A, we can have that conversation, but that's usually the questions everybody's asking. What if the first two pieces of advice was, well, go and stay and just stand. Stand on what? You stand. Stand on what's right. You stand on what the Word says. You preach the gospel faithfully. You stand against those who have held a stranglehold and bullied the church all these years and sometimes decades. You stand. Because see, in dying churches, there's usually a bunch of God's sheep who don't have a shepherd to come and protect them and care for them and fight for them. And when you enter into a renewal, church revitalization context, a dying church, that's what God's called you to go in and do. So humor me a minute, what if that's what God's called us to do? Does it not make sense to realize the playbook is to first go and stay and then stand? Take a stand, whatever that might be in your different situation. Because notice, this is what Paul does. This reason just is amazing to me. Verse 9. I can't come to you yet. I'm in Ephesus, and there are many adversaries. So Paul's like, there's no way I can leave now. Why would Paul say that? I mean, he's the apostle. He's thinking, well, if I go, who's going to protect the sheep? So we actually need to see standing for the sake of God's people is what we're called to do. Now get it. We do it lovingly, patiently. Don't go pick fights. That's not at all what I'm advocating for. And any of you all who know me know that's not what I'm saying. But there's usually something that's killed a church or put it in that unhealthy place. And oftentimes, follow me on this, if the pastors who are supposed to stand come and go and come and go and come and go, in that leadership vacuum, guess what? Somebody takes it. It's usually the people who shouldn't have it. So we got to stay if we don't want to lose heart. If we don't want to lose heart, we actually have to know that we're called to stand. Here's the third S. Shepherd. Called to shepherd. Stay, stand, shepherd. One word affiliations, they're S's. I hope you'll be able to remember those pretty easily. Stay, stand, and shepherd. And you're thinking, well, where's that one in the text? I'll show you. Don't worry. Look down verse 9 again. Paul says, I can't leave yet. A wide door of effective work is open to me, and there are many adversaries. The primary calling of a pastor, people ask, what do I do in this situation? I'm a pastor. I've gone into this church. Now what am I supposed to do? The call of a pastor is to shepherd the flock. I'm amazed, everybody. Just so you know, let me get on a soapbox a moment here, if you don't mind. I travel the world. I am shocked at how confusing this is still to people, and especially in America. We have this wealth of resource and access to all of this. The New Testament's undeniable. 1 Peter 5:2. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you. That's the clearest imperative of what pastors do. Pastors do a lot of things. What's the umbrella? The umbrella is shepherding. Acts 20 says the same thing there. So please hear me. If you're wondering what the call of a pastor is, it's not under debate, even though people are trying to make it. The call of a pastor is to shepherd people's souls. So, Paul in these two reasons highlights two of those things shepherds do. I can't imagine, to some degree in verse 9 when he says, there's this wide door of effective work that's open to me. I assume it has something to do with caring for the people of the Ephesian church as the apostle is there. I can't imagine that's not actually a big part of whatever he's talking about. The first part of shepherding is caring for the souls of people. And one of the other parts of shepherding is protecting God's people, which I think points to that second reason. So that open door of ministry, he's talking about, I think, caring for God's people, but him talking about there's adversaries here. I can't go anywhere yet. There's adversaries. He's talking about he's protecting, as an apostle, the people of God there. And by the way, I think this is the heart of the command. We're not going to turn there, but I'll just reference it for some who will know it. Acts chapter 20, Paul's final words to who? The Ephesian church. Ephesian elders, actually, the pastors there. Elder pastor, same office. Don't be confused by that. He's talking to the Ephesian pastors in Acts 20, verse 25 to 32. In verse 28, he says to them, final words, he says, pay careful attention to yourselves and all the flock. That's it. That's the call. Pay careful attention to yourselves and all the flock. And then he gives the reason why those are the two imperatives of the call of a pastor. He says, pay careful attention to all the flock, because of the very next verse, verse 29, he says, because fierce wolves will come in. Not if. They will come in, he says, to devour the flock. And he says to the Ephesian pastors, you're it. You're the protector. You're the one to care for these people when I leave. I can't imagine there's not some kind of crossover here when Paul's writing to the Corinthians and talking about this. But you know what the reason he gives in Acts 20, why he says, and pay careful attention to yourselves? He says that first, by the way, in verse 28. He gives the reason in verse 30. He says, from among yourselves will rise men speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them. From where? From yourselves. He's talking to the Ephesian pastors. He's warning them, pay careful attention to yourself as your call, and pay careful attention to all the flock as your call. Warning them essentially so you don't prove to be one of the wolves that come in and devour the flock. So I have no doubt that shepherding is the call here. And here's why this is the key to not lose heart in our work and what God's called us to. We get so anxious and wrapped up around, man, how do I fix this? Or what do I do about this? Or how do I deal with this? Or how do I change this? And what if What if we're supposed to go in and care for people the best we can? What if that's the call? What if that's the starting point? What if, to not lose heart, we stay and we stand, and then we just shepherd and care for people? Does that sound like a biblical formula? Maybe by some chance. We have complicated this way too much. And by the way, I believe one of the reasons burnout happens, people lose heart and quit and lose hope in this work, is because we are trying to make this a whole lot more about what I just said, other than what I just said. And we also put a time limit on it that's unrealistic in most cases. God calls us to shepherd God's people. And did you know that in the hardest place with adversaries and opposition and all kinds of craziness happening, just you can do that. You may not be able to change the bylaws for years. You may not be able to change who teaches Sunday school or who change anything in the service without somebody coming after you. You can just go care for people, couldn't you? And love and shepherd people and preach the word faithfully. Take stands even though it might upset people. And then just stay long enough to try to outlast the bullies if they're there. I think that's really a formula for how we do this work. And not only not lose heart, but I think it's the biblical blueprint for how God chooses to bless the church if he would choose to do so. One of the other reasons I feel passionately about this design is it's what I watched happen in our own church. So I went to a church that was about 75 years old. Again, I said urban poor context in South Louisville. I went into a church that had been in decline for over 40 years, had 30 elderly people in it when I got there in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. On their last leg, building falling down around them, financial shambles, just probably 2 to 3 years from closing, probably. And I want you to know, I'd come to believe that the Word of God is powerful enough to build the church. So I'm just my mentors had taught me well at that point. I'm going to go in and I'm going to preach the Word, I'm going to love people and disciple people and try to reach the community. And God's going to work. This is going to be great. My wife's like, are you insane? We're going there. And like most things in my marriage, she has proven to be more right than I am. And we were told it'd be a hard place, but we didn't realize how difficult it would be. So just to give you some summary, my first 5 years at the church, there were 3 different movements to get me fired at the church in the first 5 years. There were threats of violence against me by church members. At the end of 3 years, the pastoral search team that had hired me had all left the church, and they were slandering my name around the community. I would walk into cafes and restaurants that people didn't know who, I'd never walked in who met anybody, but I'd walk in, they knew who I was because search committee members had gone in there and was slandering my name when I'd walk in. At the end of those 5 years, in that third firing attempt, the church completely ran out of money. I still remember what that looked like, by the way, on the bank statement when it just hit 0. And I was the sole financial support of my wife and 4 little kids who were at home at the time. And then at the old age of 34 years old, I started to have health issues that showed up just kind of mysteriously. And they were pretty scary. I have a heart issue that I still have to manage to this day that showed up then, which is now 20 years ago. And docs couldn't figure out what was wrong until they had heard about what the first 5 years of ministry had been like for me at that church. And then they started to conclude that my body was basically shutting down over the accumulated stress that I'd endured. And they pointed it all to stress and that it was getting dangerous in what was happening to my body at 34 years old. And almost had to walk away just to try to get control of my health and things. But we got my health under control, and we ended up staying. My wife and I both felt, going back to that question of, is the work done? I know we want to leave. This is hard. Is the work done? And we both realized work's not done. So we determined we should stay. I tell people we stayed for 2 reasons, and these are legitimate reasons, by the way. The first reason we stayed, kind of a morbid curiosity of what could happen next, like after all that. You know, like if the ship's going down, will a Shakespearean play be written about this one day? Let's make it good, you know. So there's kind of a morbid curiosity, and that, I have to say legitimately in our worst moments, that was One reason we just stayed. Let's see what happens. A more important reason I stayed is I was haunted by Hebrews 13:17, which says, obey your leaders, submit to them, because they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. And I choose that word, by the way, very carefully. I use the word haunted. I wasn't inspired. I wasn't motivated. I was way past all of that. I didn't care about all that. I was haunted by that verse. And God taught me one of the most important lessons I ever learned in ministry, certainly in revitalization, renewal work, is that I will give an account for the souls that have been placed under my care. And that includes the people who don't seem to like me very much right now. Now, if we're talking about wolves, we're having a different conversation. But it dawned on me in this moment, what if I'm dealing with a bunch of wounded sheep who have no idea how to trust a pastor? Because the longest tenure of a pastor before I got there, 40 years before I got there, 4 years. Longest tenured pastor before I got there. And another lesson I learned is that wounded sheep who don't know how to trust a pastor and wolves in sheep's clothing act very similarly. And the only way to distinguish between the two is you got to love everybody. You got to invest in everybody. You got to make an effort to shepherd everybody, if that's the call. And hopefully over time, staying long enough, God begins to sort through who is who. And that's what we started to see happening in our church. So I was haunted by Hebrews 13:17. God taught me that lesson, so I decided to stay. And in the very next year, in year 6, the ship just turned. And the church flourished for the next decade plus after that. And we saw all kinds of things that happened those next 5 years plus. God started sending people from places in the city. I had no idea how they were finding us. Lay, pastor, elder, quality men showing up and bringing their families with them. We started reaching the community we had a horrible reputation in. We all of a sudden started reaching the community, seeing conversions in the community. The finances in the very next year were in the black and continued to be in the plus from that day on. But probably the most remarkable thing, we had other people coming to feeling a call in the ministry. So we started training people for pastoral ministry and missionary work in the church. But probably the most remarkable thing that happened in the next 5 years is many of the people who were trying to get me fired in the first 5 years, many of them stayed. And in the next 5 years, God completely redeemed our relationships to where they became, not just like we tolerated each other, like these people became some of my biggest supporters and dearest friends. And I mean, can we agree that that's something only God can do? I share the story with you, though, because that doesn't mean God's going to do that in your church. I just want you to hear today He can. I watched it happen. He can, and I think that's something to just trust Him with in the midst of whoever your opposition and adversaries are in the church. So there's 4 reasons I want to give you that I'm glad I did these 3 things. I stayed, not flashy, is it? I stayed, I stood, and I shepherded people. That's all I did. And God did the work that He did. And I want to give you a few reasons why I'm glad I stayed, stood, and shepherded. And then I want to move to questions at that point. So 4 reasons. So number 1, I learned the true meaning of patience. I learned the true meaning of patience. I would have told you that in the first 5 years, I was the one being patient with everybody. I was young, trying to learn how to preach, and I was working hard trying to learn how to preach, and trying to go to people's homes and see them, go to the hospitals and see them. Some people wouldn't let me come see them. If you would have asked me in those first 5 years, I would have told you, man, I am being patient with these stiff-necked people. You know what I learned the next 5 years? I actually started to learn that these people were being patient with me, just as much as I thought they were being patient. I was being patient with them. Preachers in the room, I'll prove it to you. You ready? Have you ever gone back and listened to a sermon you preached 10 years ago? Yeah, there were people there for that sermon, by the way, just so you know. We're all a work in progress, aren't we? We never arrive. God's at work in all of us. And I learned this lesson. One of the many people taught me this lady named Betty. She was a 75-year-old widow, 50-year member in the church. And Betty and I had the same routine every Sunday for the first 2 or 3 years, for sure. I'd go to the back doors to greet people as they left, and she would come to the back doors and she'd find me every Sunday. We'd have the same interaction every Sunday for like 2 to 3 years. She'd tell me two things. She'd hated my preaching and why, which was kind of helpful if you think, because she would come to me, not just tell everybody else, but came directly to me. And then told me why she hated my preaching, trying to be helpful. So, okay. And I want you to know, I did what every 29-year-old pastor would do in that moment. I dismissed everything that old woman said. I mean, I thought, she's a 75-year-old widow. What does she know about preaching? I just dismissed everything she had to say. But I knew I needed to grow as a preacher, so I worked hard trying to grow and learn. And then I, everything from reading books to prepping differently to getting feedback from trusted friends, all these things. I really tried to grow as a preacher. It took about 8 years, and I found I found my preaching voice, which is simply just figuring out who the world, each of us are supposed to be in the pulpit. We're supposed to be ourselves. We're not supposed to be a bad impression of our preaching influence. It's supposed to be ourselves. That's usually what we're all trying to work through. About 8 years in, I figured that out, and God really started to show fruit. One of the things that happened in that second 5 years is God really started showing fruit of the ministry of the Word in the church. And everybody was excited, and everybody was pleased with what was happening, and I was encouraged, and all of a sudden it dawned on me. I had changed exactly what that old woman told me to change 8 years before. And Betty, by the way, always loved it. Anytime she heard I tell this story anywhere. And our routine changed for the last several years I was there, because she became one of my dearest supporters in the whole church. And she came to the back doors the last few years I was there. She was in her 90s at this point and had suffered more than anybody I'd ever met. Buried her husband, buried 3 of her 4 kids, knee and hip replacement in the same year. And she came to the back doors, and that exchange was very different. She'd come to the back. She usually had tears in her eyes, and she'd come specifically and tell me how the Word of God was helpful to her in her suffering. And then every time gave me a big tight hug and whispered in my ear, "I think that's the best sermon you ever preached," which we all know is a big fat lie. But I knew exactly what she was trying to communicate to me, and she became one of the dearest people in the whole church to me. And there's many other stories like that. But Betty taught me patience, because I thought I was being patient. But you know what Betty did, besides coming back every week and telling me why she hated my preaching? She showed up every Sunday. She sat in that same pew in the front, second row on the front side, because that's where she sat for 50 years, even though there wasn't anybody 30 yards to her. That's where she sat. And she came and sat and heard me preach week in, week out, week in and week out, knowing, you ready for this? Knowing she was right. Just letting this young guy try to figure it out. And she came and just sat and listened to me preach. So she taught me patience. And I think we need to remember that there's people probably being patient with us as much as we think we're being with them. Lesson number 2, a reason I stayed. I watched God transform adversaries into advocates. Kind of already talked about that, but I just want to highlight that. That's truly what happened. Adversaries into advocates. And if I would have left, that's why this text means so much to me. If I would have left, I would not have experienced what is still arguably the greatest joy of my whole ministry, is seeing God taking true adversaries and turn them into advocates for me. That was a really sweet thing to see. Reason number 3, I stayed, experienced the nearness of Jesus. I think I felt very alone in those early years, and the second 5 years I look back on that and realized that Jesus was uniquely near me and with me. So I want to encourage you with that. Just because you may feel alone and isolated, and you're trying to ask, where in the world is Jesus in the midst of this mess? I just want to promise you, he's there. Just because you don't feel he's there does not mean he's gone. He's there. And I think he's uniquely with his under-shepherds, who he's called to care for his sheep of all people. So don't lose heart. Here's the last reason I stayed. I realized what it really means to thrive. I'm really glad I stayed. I stayed 17 years until 5.5 years ago I left to lead this ministry full time. And I realized what it means to thrive. And here's what I mean by that. At the end of 17 years, when I left, we had 75 members present at church when I left. Now, come on. Some of you are expecting me to say we're running 1,000, aren't you? Come on. 75 members present, $120,000 annual budget. We never had much money at all. I was constantly trying to find extra work just because the church could never support me for the 17 years I was there. Now, I'm very aware of my Southern Baptist background and years in ministry that some of you might even be tempted to hear me say that and go, wow, 17 years, 75 people, $120,000 annual budget? Some might be tempted to think, isn't that a failure? At least in our circles, isn't that a failure? Well, I want to tell you a couple other things about the church when I left that I think challenge that for those who might think that. Out of those 75 members, there were 5 generations present. We were from little babies up to 95-year-old widows. See, when I read the New Testament, I read Titus 2, it doesn't tell me anything about how many people are supposed to be there. It just tells me who's supposed to be there. And it's supposed to be multi-generational, multi-ethnic, people from all kinds of different backgrounds, all together in one church, united in Christ. That's the picture of the church. And we had that. In fact, there were 14 different nationalities that came through the church in my time there. And by the way, the church was all white in one generation when I got there, and we're hostile to minorities, particularly African Americans in our community. And by the time I left, we had 14 different nationalities that had come through, become members and leaders, and some were even raised up and sent back to their home countries as missionaries. And out of those 75 people, in 17 years, we raised up, we identified, raised, and trained up and sent out 32 families, either to the mission field around the world or into pastoral ministry somewhere around the world. So our church became a huge sending church, under 100 people and no money doing so. So why am I glad I stayed? I learned what it means to be a thriving church. So if you hear anything, hear me say this, then I'm going to open it for questions. Let no one determine the significance of your ministry on numbers or money. That is just an absolutely unbiblical and unhelpful way to evaluate the significance of the ministry you're doing there. Can we all agree to please stop it? And let's look at the spiritual fruit that God sees and God cares about. We are putting way too much focus on this. Sorry, when I'm in our environment, I just feel the need to always highlight that. Because so often pastors are discouraged because of the amount of people that are there, they don't have many resources. And that is not a reflection on whether there's meaningful and fruitful ministry and that God is maybe even helping a church thrive. I work with churches all over the world who have absolutely nothing from a resource standpoint. And the main pastoral issue is, is everybody going to eat this week? And I see thriving churches being built all over the world just like that. Can we stop focusing on the wrong things? So to wrap this and move to Q&A, one of the best ways to avoid losing your heart in this work is stop evaluating your ministry and everybody else's with the wrong worldly things that we so often do that with. So I want to take a moment and pray for us and then take a minute, take some questions. Lord, you know our hearts and you know the weariness and fatigue we feel. Would you strengthen us? Remind us that you're at work, you're with us. Lord, give us spiritual eyes to see and evaluate our own ministries, not how the world does, but how you do. And encourage us, and you would keep our heart in it. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Just last few minutes, though, I would like to open it up for questions or thoughts. I've said a lot, I know. I'm very aware my story can stir up some things, maybe in your own story. So you want to share something you can or a question, either way, for the last few minutes that we have.
Real quick, could you talk about the difference between a bully and a wolf? How do we know what we know?
A bully could be a wolf, but not necessarily. That's the tricky part. A bully may be a wounded sheep who doesn't know how to trust a shepherd, and that's how they just show up in their anger and pain and hurt. So I think that's the thing to know. A bully is not automatically a wolf, but it can be. So I think we have to love and care for people to the level that would maybe help earn their trust at some point. That's the goal. If you can earn their trust, that they truly see that you care about them, you will begin to see, I think, what's true, what's really there. Until they trust you, they're going to have their guard up. You just need to assume that. And the worst mistake we can make is think because all of a sudden we got a title and it was put on the sign and we got an office that somehow they should trust us. No. Most church revitalization renewal situations, you're not starting at ground zero. You're below ground zero. You're dealing with a bunch of distrusting people. So you got to earn that trust to even bring you to ground zero and then continue to earn that trust. But once you do, I think that's what I experienced with my adversaries becoming advocates. Once you win them, they're yours. Like, come after me in the latter years of my ministry. Like, it's ironic the people who were coming after me, they would have been the first ones to jump in and fight. So once you win them, you will win them. But it takes a lot. The bullies, you have to almost deal with that hard exterior, their harsh words, their attacks even. That's what's so uniquely hard about this. Is like to not want to lash back, to not want to fight back. But you have to really love people well who are hard to love. And I think that's how you sort through who the bullies are. And it takes, I think, certainly years, not months, to figure out who the bullies are. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
You mentioned just wanting some more thoughts on it, because the timeline of being in a ministry, being in a church, and seeing your budget go to zero. I'm in a situation where I'm looking at the timeline, I'm looking at the budget, and that's kind of the backstop. Like, how did you navigate that panic, knowing you're heading that direction? What advice do you have there?
Man, it's a great question, and I certainly didn't figure this out, so I'll take a stab at it. But I think we have to function in the church like hopefully we responsibly do within our own lives, and that's, I mean, it's a numbers game. You got this much money. Until you know other money's coming in, this is what you have to work with. If you spend more than that, you're going to run out of money. Like, I think, so part of it has to do with you have to have an honest conversation of what's really here to work with. And I think for the pastor, who a lot of times we are financially supported fully, or at least in part in that way, here's the gauge. Let me see if I can articulate this. The gauge is, what's a greater stress to you? Town. That's the only thing we did. But 10, 11 years in, my wife's like, this is all just a lot, too much. Like, we're just immersed in it, have been. It's a tough community we lived in. And our kids were being put in school across town, so for different reasons. So we moved. And I kind of said, I'll do the commute back to church. But I had no idea. But just some of the relief she felt from all the church stuff all the time, I think bought me a few more years than I would have had otherwise. She was wearing out so I say that unapologetically. Again, let's go and give our lives to the ministry and die preaching the gospel and doing what God calls us to. But the reality is, your wife and children typically aren't as gung-ho as you are about doing whatever God's called you to do. So let's love them well by creating as good a quality of life for them as possible. So I had a pastor who lived in the inner city near the church, rough area. They lived there a decade. And he came to me and felt guilty, like, man, I don't think my family can do this anymore, but I don't think I'm supposed to leave the church. And I'm like, move somewhere that actually where your kids can maybe go play in the yard, where it's too dangerous to do that now, or whatever. And he did, and it was a game changer. We moved to a neighborhood where my kids could ride their bike without me having to be with them. Small things like that matter. Sorry, they just do. And so create as good a quality of life for your family as you can, so you can go out and do what God's called you to do. It's easy. It's a helpful way for them to support you in the work. So, yeah.
Brian, we're at time,
Yep,
but
thank you.
I'll take a segue. Let's thank Brian. Thank you, Brian. I want to mention a couple of resources that you may not know about. First of all, we were talking about families and spouses. Some of the wives of pastors and our staff have a ministry wives group that meets on occasion. They meet about once a quarter, and they're also accessible just to talk to your wife. If your wife's had it with your church and she might have had it with you, you can reach out to the ministry wives, and they're just there to encourage and listen and support. My wife is we were replanters, we were renewal pastors for 9 years. So I was the renewal pastor, and my wife